Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Zoomtime Knowledge. This free public presentation series is provided by the James Madison University Lifelong Learning Institute. My name is Rodney Wolfenbarger. I serve as program director. I'm also joined by Sue G. Sue is our program assistant, and she is managing the technology for today's meeting. It's also our pleasure to present today's featured guest presenter, Rabbi Peter Grumbacher. Having retired from his congregation in Wilmington, Delaware, Rabbi Grumbacher has served in an interim capacity in synagogues in the Shenandoah Valley, including Harrisonburg. He's also served as chair of the Delaware State Human Relations Commission, among other agencies. The title of his presentation today is Sharing the Silence. The son of a Holocaust survivor tells his story. And Peter, welcome. We thank you for volunteering your time today and sharing this story with us.
It's my pleasure to do so. Over the course of the last 20-something years, as I say, I have never turned down an invitation to speak on this subject. I guess you want me to start.
Whenever you're ready, Peter, you can begin your presentation. We'll stand by if anything happens with the technology. We'll make sure we continue bringing people into the room.
Fine. So, this whole thing really began in terms of any kind of a formal presentation soon after the Columbine High School shooting in, I believe it was 1995 or 9. In any case, the impetus came, I'm a very, very close friend with a retired Lutheran minister. We've been very friendly for decades now. And he and I spoke about figuring out what we could do in light of this school shooting. We talked about, what the meaning of it is, how it could impact the kids in our congregations, but more so how it would impact the kids in the school district in which both of us had our congregations. He was actually a next door neighbor of ours. The Lutheran church was right next to our synagogue. So we talked about the impact of violence. And I said to him, well, look, all I can really talk about is certain limited things about my dad's experiences in the Holocaust, because he really never spoke about it. And I said, what is it that you're going to talk about? He said, well, he was the chaplain. I'll put it in his words. I was the chaplain at Kent State University when the shooting by the National Guard took place. And so both of us had a reason to address the issue. His was certainly, firsthand. So we went to the school district and we said that we would like to talk to the kids. We didn't even know whether they would accept the idea. And we spoke in one high school, and we talked about the impact of both of those experiences on us. And then they asked us if we would speak to other kids. So we went to a couple of the other high schools in the area, and we went to the middle schools in the area. And what came out of it was a decision by the district to have like support groups. Not that anything happened there, thank God, but they wanted the kids to talk about the feelings that they had about the shooting, in the Columbine High School. So, as I said, I really knew very, very little about it because my dad didn't speak, and which, by the way, is the reason for the title of this talk, Sharing the Silence. I was very limited as far as the information that I had. And in 2003, I was given a sabbatical by my congregation. And I really didn't know what it was I wanted to do. I already had had 2 sabbaticals across my career. And in both cases, we studied my wife and I studied in Israel. And I wanted to do something different. So I was in my daughter's college class talking about this subject. And after the class, she says to me, "Are you okay?" Of course, she said that to me many, many times before and since. But I said, "Yeah, why?" And she said, "Because all of a sudden, your face went blank and you said, that's it. And I went, I did? So of course I had to replay that tape. And that's it means this is what it is that I want to do on my sabbatical. I set it up with a number of churches, synagogues, universities, and Rotaries and places like that. So I spent from October through December of 2003 driving around the country. Just in case you're interested, I drove 10,868 miles, leaving some time to do some exploration. And I spoke to all of these groups. In the meantime, between 95 and 2003, other things came to the surface about my father's experiences. So I want to tell you a little bit about my background. I grew up in Washington Heights, which is a neighborhood in the northern part of Manhattan. Above us is Inwood and below us is Harlem. And Washington Heights was lovingly called the Fourth Reich because there were more German Jews who moved to that area of Manhattan before the war, and if they were lucky, during the war and after the war. And so therefore, in my elementary school and in my high school and in my synagogue, there were so many people, so many kids who were children of Holocaust survivors. The interesting thing in my synagogue, which was, I would say, primarily comprised of Holocaust survivors, we never, ever, ever heard a thing spoken about the Holocaust. I understand that the only time it was addressed was during the memorial service on Yom Kippur, which we had last Monday. But other than that, I never heard a sermon. It was never addressed in a religious school class. It was a subject that was as quiet in the synagogue as it was in my home. I grew up with 4 other guys. We were very close and remain so today. And ultimately, I found out that all but one of them had similar experiences in terms of their parents being survivors and in terms of the silence pervading the home. Later on, you can ask me about why the silence pervaded and the impact of it. Anyway, in my parents' apartment in the den, there were medallions, there were medals, there were commendations, there were letters, all indicating my dad's experience in World War II in the United States Army. And on the wall, when you came into the apartment, there were 3 unique icons. One was a sword, one was a walking stick, and one was a Luger. I was basically told, leave those things alone, which I did up until a point when I got too curious. And anytime, and this is important, anytime that I asked my father, what is all of this stuff about? He gave me his standard answer, which was a combination of dismissing me, irrelevance. He would go, ach. That was his answer, ach. So, you know, I mean, he ached me all over the place. And this is what I grew up with. So one day, I think I was about 8 years old. I was in my grandmother and aunt and uncle's home, which the apartment directly below. We were in apartment 32. They were in apartment 22. God forbid I should go upstairs to our apartment before saying hello to them in their apartment. But anyway, I was a little kid and I came in and I realized at that point that all of my friends had grandparents on both sides, mother and father, their parents. So in my family, my parents and my grandmother and aunt and uncle spoke German. And the reason they did so was different from the Jews from Eastern Europe. Those people did not speak Yiddish at home, except when they didn't want their kids to understand. And that's when they spoke Yiddish. My parents said, he's going to learn English anyway, we might as well speak German. And I have a cousin who's a rabbi, and his parents said the exact same thing. So we grew up basically with German being our mother tongue. So I go into the apartment one day, and I said to my grandmother, we called her Oma, I said, Oma, what happened to my other Oma? Now, her husband, my grandmother was living, her husband, I knew he died in 1950. I was 3 years old. I had a vague recollection of him, but I had no idea about my father's side of the family. So my grandmother said to me, Hitler hat sie ermordet. Hitler killed her. Now, let me tell you, I'm sure many of you know that growing up in the 1950s, kids would watch Cowboys and Indians. So every single week, whether it was the Lone Ranger or Roy Rogers or Hopalong Cassidy or the Cisco Kid, somebody got killed, whatever that meant. And so I figured some bad dude by the name of Hitler killed my grandmother. Okay, it basically meant nothing to me. But I went upstairs and I said to my mother, Mom, do you know what Oma said to me? She said, no. I said, Oma told me that a guy named Hitler killed my other Oma. And my mother's face, her look to me was something I had never seen before and I never saw afterwards. It was one of those telling looks. I remember she was wearing a pair of dark eyeglasses. She had a bowl in her hand, which I believe had either mashed potatoes or lettuce. And she stopped in her tracks. And she looked at me with that look. And that look told me, never bring the subject up again. And whatever you do, never, ever mention it to your father. Did she really say that? No. But that's exactly what I took out of that look, because it was so unique, so different, and so strange, really was. So that's about the extent of what I knew. I didn't know anything, except one day I was already ordained as a rabbi, and I was in Wilmington, Delaware, my congregation. I was 25 years old, and my wife's parents came for one of our holiday meals, and her brother also came along. So we had the meal, and then we were cleaning up the table, and I was bringing out dishes. And all of a sudden, I hear my brother-in-law, who at the time was like maybe 20, I hear him say to my father, Ernie, I understand you were in Dachau. What happened? Well, I stopped in my tracks, and my father started to talk. And I said to myself, if you walk into that dining room now, he is going to stop talking. He's going to zip the lip. I had to wait and listen. Well, you can only wait so long. So I heard a little bit. And I go in there, and sure enough, the conversation stopped abruptly, mid-word, let alone mid-sentence. And we went on with dessert, etc. And the next morning, I was home with my parents, alone. My wife had gone to work. And I said to my father, Dad, I don't know if you realize this, and I raised my voice, but Larry is not related to us by blood. And he looks at me and he said, what are you talking about? And I said, you told him more than you ever told me about what happened to you in Dachau. And my father gave me his standard answer, ach. And I said to him, don't ach me anymore. Do not ach me anymore. So he started telling me a little bit. And I suppose what happened was it got a little bit too, too difficult for him to continue with the conversation. So let me tell you the experience that he had, because before I do that, I want to say that one of the reasons that I give this talk, and I used to use this as the introduction, is that every day 1,000 World War II veterans and many Holocaust survivors are dying. I realized that when I said it, it was absolutely true, but that was 20 years ago. And now there are so few Holocaust survivors around, and most of those people, if they're able to, don't want to say anything. And therefore it is my generation to speak. Also, because my dad was a veteran of World War II, there's so few World War II veterans around that on top of the Holocaust experience, he was a soldier, and I had to speak about that as well. So this is what happened, and again, a lot of the stuff that I learned was like step by step. It didn't all come at once. And the interesting thing is, when I was driving around the country, my cousin, who's 12 years older than I am, was often the source of some of the answers to my questions that people asked. The only problem with that is that by the time I got the answer, I was already at the next venue, and I wasn't able to answer the question for the one who asked it. But I had the information for the next group. So it was on November the 9th and 10th, 1938, which is called Kristallnacht, the night of shattered glass, which I'm sure all of you heard about. And on that evening and the next morning, meaning during the night, the Germans set fire to most of the synagogues in Germany. And they also destroyed the storefronts of the businesses that are owned by Jews. In those synagogues, of course, were scrolls of the Torah scrolls, the 5 books of Moses. And there were people in there who would save these scrolls because of the most precious things that we have. But people in my congregation in Wilmington saw their synagogues going up in smoke, and it was a terrible time. Now, that was technically the beginning of the Holocaust. It was not the beginning of the discrimination against the Jews. That began in 1933 when Hitler came to power. So in those 5 years, the creation of irrelevant, I won't even say humans, but the Germans were able to make us feel like nothing. And of course, the Germans were able to make the regular folks in Germany treat us like nothing. And the rules got more and more stringent. All of the things we couldn't do based on the Nuremberg laws. There's a book, by the way, which is fascinating, and it just popped into my head, written by Eric Larson. It's called it'll come to me, but it's about the first ambassador of the United States to be the ambassador to Germany when Hitler came to power. The story is very interesting, but besides that, you could see the subtle way that Hitler and his henchmen were able to minimize our existence without doing anything, quote unquote. I'll give you an example of that. My mother always said to me, when she would call the operator, she lived in a tiny town, which I'll get to in a moment. When she would call the operator to get somebody's phone number and they asked for the spelling, my mother would go through whatever it is. When she got to the letter S, my mother always said S wie in sow, S as in a pig. And we figured it was because, she knew that the operator might have been a Nazi sympathizer or whatever it was. I'm reading this book, and all of a sudden I get this aha moment. It says in there that people were not allowed to use any name from the Hebrew scriptures, from the Old Testament, when they were asking for the spelling of a name. So if you got to S, you couldn't say Samuel. Okay, that was not allowed. You couldn't say Abraham for an A or Sarah for an S. So my mother used Sow, and she laughed. But in fact, that was the case. You couldn't. So my mother's hometown was very, very small. As a matter of fact, at the turn of the last century, there were more Jews living in that town than there were Gentiles, which is really incredible. November 9th, my parents were in that town. The town's called Hechingen. They were visiting my grandfather, my mother's father, who had been in the hospital. He was in the hospital, actually. Now, they had lived after their wedding, and their wedding was March 15th, 1938. They lived in my dad's city of Wiesbaden. So they went to Hechingen, and on that day, November 9th, 1938, they were in the middle of the night. There was a knock on the door. My father went down to answer, and standing there were agents of the Gestapo. And they asked for my grandfather, whose name was Isidore Weil. And my father said, he's not here, he's in the hospital. So they asked him who he was, and he said, I'm his son-in-law. And then they asked him that question, are you a Jew? And he said, yes. And they arrested him, put him on a truck along with the other Jewish men in the town, and off he went to Dachau. Now, Dachau, it's interesting, it was the first concentration camp built, and it was the last concentration camp used for extermination. Because, from what I understand, it was the only concentration camp actually in Germany. And ironically, Hitler didn't want any blood in his land. So, in the meantime, my parents had applied for all of the necessary documents needed to leave Germany. And none of them had come yet to my parents at the time when he was interred at Dachau. Well, what happened was it came while he was there. And my mother received these things and she didn't know what to do with them. So she had a choice. Her choice was bring him to my father or not bring him to my father. And she made a decision which some people felt was truly incredibly dumb. She went to Dachau. Okay? So, according to the story, which I understand is factual, she walked around the perimeter of Dachau and saw my father and called him, and he went over and she passed the documents to him through the fence. Now, if you ever saw The Boy in the Striped Pajamas, which is a wonderful movie and I highly recommend it, you will know, as you know probably anyway, that there were no pockets in these pajamas that the prisoners wore. Under the pajamas was nothing. So what is my father going to do with those documents? So he also had a choice. He could hold on to them. He could try to find a place to hide them. He could dig a hole and hide them. Or he could do what it is that he did. And here too was a decision that most people think was absolutely ridiculous. My father had, later on in the story, you'll see how brave he was, but this was amazing. And I always get goosebumps telling the story because, you'll see why. My father decided he was going to go to the commandant. So here's a Jewish prisoner, that the guards and everybody else, felt was garbage in the eyes of the Lord, let alone the eyes of the Germans. And he marches himself into the office of the commandant. He takes the stuff, puts it down on the table, and he says, I have the documents that allow me to leave this country. Now, the commandant could have killed him on the spot, but the commandant did not. Fortunate for my dad and me and everybody else, the commandant was as anal retentive as any German was, and he takes a look at all of the documents my father has, and he says, alles in Ordnung, everything is in order, leave. Guess what he did? He left. So now I want to take a moment to explain something else. I told you what it is that my mom did and what it is that my father did. My mom passed the documents through the fence and my father took them. I was in Dachau in 1970. We had lived 1969, 1970 in Israel for the year. And on the way back, we went through Europe like every other person our age did at the time. And of course, we did it on the $5 Europe on $5 a day book, which is, is probably in some archive in terms of the money. And we went to Munich. We went to my mother's hometown, and we went to Dachau. Dachau is right outside of Munich. My wife and I decided, well, we're going to buy a sandwich, and we're going to go when we get hungry, we're going to take out the sandwich and have our lunch, and then we'll get to Dachau. Well, let me tell you something. It did not take long at all to get from the bus station to Dachau. And it made us wonder, well, for heaven's sake, people, quote, didn't know what was going on. It was right there. So we went there, and again, let me emphasize that at that point, I knew very, very little about what was happening, what had happened to my dad. So we do the tour of Dachau, very interesting, and that was that. Well, about 5 years ago, we went back. And now I had all of this information, and I wanted to check out whether or not what I was thinking was actually true. Because truth be told, I didn't remember a thing about that first visit. The first thing I wanted to find out was whether in those days, that fence was electrified. So, of course, I saw all of the connections, not that it was then, but yes, it was electrified. So my mother had to put her hand through that electrified fence in order to give that stuff to my father. That's number one. Number two, my father wasn't able to just walk over, like you would at a softball game, and pick up an extra glove. There was a huge ditch. My father had to fall into the ditch or jump into the ditch and somehow or other jump up, get up on the other side for my mother to be able to reach him. Number three, there were guard towers all over the place, and the guards had guns. So I don't know what exactly happened, but thank God it happened, and the bravery that was shown by my mother was just incredible. Anyhow, he takes out documents. He leaves Dachau. Oh, I forgot to tell you one more thing. My father told me this early on. He said, when I walked out of Dachau, the commandant says to me, Grumbacher, with your physique, you would have made a wonderful Nazi. My father said, just what I wanted to hear. He said, so I chose not to even turn around, let alone acknowledge him. And I just kept on walking right out of the place. So my father goes to where my mom was. I guess it was somehow or other he got to Eschingen. And then they went to Wiesbaden to say goodbye to his mother and to his sisters. So he was in Dachau for 6 weeks. And on January 1st, 1939, he and my mother were on a boat leaving for the United States. When he got to this country, the first thing he wanted to do was to get the documents necessary to get his mother and his sisters out of Germany. What you needed more than anything was an affidavit signed by an American citizen stating that you would not be a ward of the state. That person would take care of you economically. If you didn't have that, you could have everything else. They were not going to let you into this country. Period. End of story. So my father had to find an American citizen who would sign this for him. And I remember there were 3 people. My grandmother, who was a widow, her husband died way before, and his 2 sisters. So here's where I'm going to ask you a question, and I am going to ask them to unmute you, not now, to give me the answer that you think. The question is, what American citizen do you think my father asked for the affidavit? Okay, shoot out the answers. I'm waiting.
Maybe a black
President?
The president. Everybody says that first. No. Pope. There are 97 people. Come on, give me an answer.
Rabbi.
No, Rabbi.
The mayor.
No. Okay, you can mute him again. The governor of New York City. No. Of New York. No. All right, I will tell you.
Soldier.
You all muted? You can mute him again. Okay, ready? My father wrote to
Let's make sure we got, Peter, we accidentally muted you. My apologies.
All right. Okay. Okay, so he wrote to Albert Einstein, and Einstein wrote back to him and said, the letter said, "Dear Mr. Grumbacher, thank you very much. Unfortunately, the State Department of the United States will not allow me to write any more affidavits. I've already written 250. My father couldn't get anybody else. Ultimately, it turned out that his mother and his two sisters died in Auschwitz. That's a story in and of itself. But here's the question. Why is it that my father wrote to Einstein? So I asked this of everybody that I speak to. You know, kids and adults, it doesn't matter. Religion, it doesn't matter. And none of the answers is correct because it was a strange thing. Einstein, his nephew, was married to my father's sister. So Einstein wasn't even able to save his nephew. I said to my father, when he was telling me these things, I said, "Dad, by any chance, did you happen to save the letter from Albert Einstein?" And my father said, "Ach." That was an ach I couldn't believe, but he didn't save the letter. So when my father and mother came to this country, they became citizens. And what's interesting also, there's other facts about this, that many people who came to this country from Europe became citizens very, very quickly. I believe there was a huge facility in Hagerstown, Maryland, that just processed, especially Jews who came, you know, because they needed the soldiers. My father enlisted, and he was given a choice. Do you want to go fight in Europe, or do you want to fight the Japanese? Now, most of the people that he knew at the time chose not to go back to Europe because it was too painful for them, because they knew they lost relatives in the Holocaust. And they chose to fight against the Japanese. My father said, I'm going back there. Okay. Now, you know that my father was brave just walking into the commandant's office. So one day when I was a mere tyke and I was getting nosy, I was looking around the house. Of course, I was there after school by myself. My dad and mom were at work. And the first thing I did was I checked out those icons that we had on the wall when you walked into the apartment. And I took out the sword, which was beautiful. It had all the jewelry on it. And I lifted the walking stick off the wall, and it was really magnificent. But I noticed that there was something, I don't know, just something. And there was like a little button on top, and I pushed the button, and it released a dagger right out of the walking stick. So Peter said to himself, "Discretion is the better part of valor, Peter." I put it back in the sheath, and I put them all perfectly still, you know, because don't touch those things. And the Luger was there, and it was filled with lead, meaning you couldn't fire it anymore. My dad had it, you know, made it inoperable. So put that one back. But what I used to do in those days, my mother and my grandmother had a very large collection of photographs from my mom's hometown of Hechingen, from my grandmother's hometown of Geilingen, which was near the Swiss border, which is totally irrelevant to the story. And they used to, you know, show me this and that, you know. I guess, I don't know if I was interested or not, but I looked. To the point where, let me just say, that when my wife and I went to Hechingen, my mom's hometown, we took the regional train, and we were on a trestle when we got out of the train. And my wife says, "Where do we go?" And I look down. Remember, we're not talking about New York City. And I look down and I point, "There." She said, "There? How do you know?" I said, "I just know." So we went down the stairs and we walked there. And sure enough, that was where we had to go, because I'd seen so many photographs and my mother and grandmother pointed everything out that it was just second nature to me. I just knew that's where we had to go. Where was I? I lost my place. Oh yes. So I'm looking at the photograph albums again, and I see an album that I had never seen before. And it was sort of pushed back from the shelf. So I took it out, and it's basically blank. There were a few photographs in the front of it, and I did the old, with the pages, and I noticed that tucked into one of the pages is a piece of paper. I take out the piece of paper, and I open it up, and it's a newspaper article from one of the New York City newspapers, and I'm reading it, and it's about my father. And I could not believe what I was reading. So my parents come home, and I said to my father, Dad, look what I found. And I showed, so what is that? I said, it's a newspaper article that I found in the photo album. And he's, squints his eyes and he goes, ach, like it's not important. Well, let me tell you what the ach was. It was about him. And he and his other people in his platoon were the ones who were surviving. The Germans had totally surrounded them, and one by one they were being picked off. I don't know how many were left. I have no idea, but it was definitely not many. My father was a religious person, not all that observant, but he believed in miracles. And the kind of miracle he believed in was this. If God wants to help you, that's wonderful, but you got to do it yourself. So my father made a decision, another one of his brave decisions. Now remember, my parents, they spoke German. So my father, in his unbelievably strong voice, he never had to lift a finger to me. All he had to do was open his mouth, and that was it. In his strong voice, he yells out in German, very authoritarian. Put down your rifles, we're surrounded by the Americans. The guys in his platoon look at him like this guy is out of his mind. All of a sudden, silence. And they come out of the woods with their hands behind their heads, no weapons in their arms, and they surrendered. In our tradition on Hanukkah, we have an expression, a great miracle happened there. And truly, according to my father's definition, a great miracle happened there. I mean, so that, again, I get goosebumps thinking about it. So this was in this article, and he never spoke about it. Never, ever, ever. And all of these things, I put together step by step and went around the country, and I spoke to groups about it. And I spoke because I said, if I don't do it, who's going to do it? We're already 70-something years past World War II and past the Holocaust. And as I told you, I used to say 1,000 veterans are dying a day. I don't say that anymore. Right now, what I say is just take a look at the world in which we're living and the country in which we're living, and all of those white supremacists and all of the neo-Nazis and not only that, but so many people who deny the Holocaust. Let me tell you something. If I mentioned 6 million Jews to a group, 6 million means very, very little. But you tell one story about one person, and that has far greater meaning. And that's why I told you I accept every invitation to speak. So, oh yeah, I did want to tell you about my mom's hometown, because this is interesting too. Not in Wilmington, Delaware, there were many, many, many Holocaust survivors. And those who spoke about their experiences, we realized not one of them was the same as the next one. Every single one was unique. Every single one was created goosebumps. Every one of them was dramatic, one way or the other. My dad's story, compared to those, is not as dramatic, but it's his story, as I like to say, history, his story. And therefore, it's my story. And it becomes my children's story. So, so that's why it's important to me. Now, my parents, my wife and I went to Hechingen to visit, and we went to the synagogue where they were married. one of the only synagogues in Germany that had not been burnt down in the on Kristallnacht. Now, in those, I looked on the internet. When you look up Hechingen, at least at that time, the first thing you see is a destroyed synagogue, the inside. You know, the prayer books were ripped up. Everything was just a complete disaster. But the building stood. Now, why did the building stand? The guy who was a carpenter in that town went to the Nazis when they knew they were coming in and said to them, you know, that's the synagogue over there. And I want to use that synagogue as a new workshop because it's the perfect size for me. So whatever you want to do on the inside is your business, but please do not destroy, don't burn it down. So they didn't. Turns out that this man was Jewish and no one knew it. So he built his workshop there, and afterwards he became the caretaker of the Jewish cemetery and set up all the stones that the Nazis had knocked over or destroyed, whatever. And it's just amazing. I had, I'm not sure where it is, I had the key to that synagogue, which is now, it's in use again, which is really another miracle. But it is in use again because many Jews from the former Soviet Union came to Germany, and a large enough group, you know, settled in Hechingen to begin the synagogue all over again. Well, I'm going to open it up to your questions, and as I always tell kids when I open it up for questions, the only thing I ask is you don't ask me a stupid question. Now, the definition of a stupid question is when you don't ask. So therefore, anything is up for, you know, for me to answer if I can. And if I can, I'll make it up.
Peter, thank you. We've extended everyone the ability to unmute your microphones during this question and response period. And please, you know, Peter has invited you to speak to him directly. Feel free to do so.
I'd like 1 minute. There's another thing I want to talk about. Remember I said I went around the country, and one of the places I went to speak was in a synagogue in Cincinnati, Ohio, where that's where my seminary was located. And I'd been there for services, but I'd never gotten a tour. And a good friend of mine was the rabbi of that congregation. I asked him for a tour. And we went into the library, and I noticed on one of the tables was a pulpit Bible. And a pulpit Bible is a really large Bible like so. And I figured, well, for whatever reason, it's not in the sanctuary on the pulpit, it's in the library. Okay, but I didn't say anything. Went into another place, there were two. There was another pulpit. So finally I said to him, Gary, I said, why do you have two pulpit Bibles here and none in your sanctuary? And he said, oh, am I glad you asked? He said, those aren't pulpit Bibles. Open it up. What they were facsimile of pages from books that the Nazis had listed the names and the dates of birth and the dates they were murdered of the Jews of Germany in the 2 volumes, this thick each. So I looked up, now I have to explain something. In our tradition, the anniversary of the death of someone is celebrated with special prayers and the lighting of a candle. My father did not know when his mother and sisters died. So he would always commemorate their memory on their birthday. And I knew that my grandmother's birthday was July the 18th. I did not know about my aunts. I didn't know that. So I looked for Emily Grumbacher in that big book. And sure enough, there it is, July the 18th, all of the details. And I looked up his sister, who did not marry Einstein's nephew, and I found her, all of the details. My dad already had died, so I wasn't able to tell him that, but that would have been a very meaningful thing for him to know. Okay.
Peter, did your parents ever go back to Germany or Dachau?
Yes, they did. They went to Germany in 1979. Now, the reason they went back to Germany was because in those days, many, many, many German towns and villages and even cities invited the Jews back who had lived there. And everything was paid for. Their travel was paid for. They were wined and dined. And my mother was saying that they had, there was a castle on top of the mountain, the Hohenzollern. And the prince of the castle came down and was the honored guest at this fancy banquet that they had. And what happened was that there were so many Jews who were part of that town. They had to do it in two times. So at the time that my parents went, they had made my father the spokesperson for the group. When we came back from Germany the first time, from Israel and Germany, miraculously he found two things. Well, this was later on, but he did find a film of their wedding, which was in mint condition in that synagogue. Really amazing. But he found in 1979, when they were there, they had a tape. He gave me the tape of the events. And I'm listening to this tape over and over and over again. There was something about it that bothered me, and I couldn't put my finger on it. Finally, aha! I said, Dad, why did you give your speech completely in English? Because his German was perfect. And he said, I opened my mouth. I couldn't get a word of German out. So, whatever. So yes, they did go back, and their feeling was, they were not furious at the Germans. My parents, that was never their attitude at all.
Thank you. And Esther, I know I muted your microphone back, and a few other people had their microphones unmuted. That was just to stop the feedback. So if anyone else who had their microphone unmuted, you can unmute it again and jump in with your question. I want to make sure everyone could hear Peter's response.
This is Sophia. When you were traveling and doing your presentations, were you ever confronted with groups that would come and say, oh, the Holocaust never happened?
No. As a matter of fact, before I left, somebody had asked me, or somebody said to me, you're probably going to meet some Holocaust deniers. So I had my secretary look up, this was sort of the early days of the internet, look up, stuff about the Holocaust deniers. I figured, a couple of pages. There were like 65 pages devoted to that. No, I did not, never did. However, every single group of kids that I've spoken to, at the end I say, all I ask you is one thing. If anybody says to you the Holocaust never happened, look them in the eye and say three words, the Holocaust happened. Because these people know the Holocaust happened. They're just anti-Semitic and they want to do it for their own, terrible reasons. But I was never, ever confronted, and I had all kinds of groups and all kinds of individuals.
Peter, my name's Dave Pruitt, and I don't have a question, but a little bit of a PS to share. My father, who died 6 years ago, was a World War II vet. He ended the war in the 45th Division, and the 45th and the 42nd Divisions liberated Dachau. I have a letter that my dad wrote to his mother, my grandmother, dated late April 1945. And she sent it to the local hometown paper that published it. And it's an eyewitness account of the liberation of Dachau.
Yeah.
And it is our family's most cherished heirloom. And I also have, in your research, there's a story that might be worth digging up, but I've been to the Munster, the big cathedral in Ulm, and the stained glass windows were removed during the war to protect them. Most of them were returned, but there's some new windows there. And of course, that was the hometown of Einstein, but one of the windows in the Ulm Munster was donated by the synagogue. And I have no idea about why or what precipitated that, but I suspect there must have been some heroic people associated with that cathedral.
But you bring up, thank you very much for that. You bring up a question that I had for you, and actually I think I know the answer. Did your dad talk about what his experiences?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
Yeah, no.
Yeah, well, can I just throw something in here?
Mhm.
Holocaust survivors, liberators, and soldiers, the only people they might have spoken to about it were those people who'd had the same experience.
Mhm.
They did not talk about it. And I'm always given the question, why is it that, for example, Holocaust survivors didn't? And the answer is, well, it's not very simple, but there are a few reasons. Number one, they came to this country and they wanted to start a new life. And they didn't want to burden their children with all of the terrible things that had happened to them. So they kept all of this down. All of it was just totally, recessed. And I want to tell you something, it was the biggest mistake, because there's a book called The Children of the Holocaust, and it's about people my age. It's not about the kids who died in the Holocaust, people my age. It was by Helen Epstein, like about 40 years ago or so. And she indicates that the children of Holocaust survivors lived in homes that were so dark, figuratively speaking. The parents knew why they had this depression, but the kids didn't know why they had the depression. Everything was negative. And what happened was the kids had major psychological issues. Now, I didn't, because of course I'm perfect. But one of the reasons, even though my parents didn't talk about it at all, they were very involved with their synagogue. So they also brought religion into the home. So apparently that was a very important thing as well. But you talk to people like your dad who liberated concentration camps, never talked about it. And soldiers, my father's best friends were guys he served with. That's it. They understood each other. The other thing is why they didn't speak is because I don't think it was, it was official then, but it's PTSD. Some of these people had such terrible experiences, they just didn't want to bring it up, because who knows what the consequence of mentioning it over and over again would be. But it's one of those things where the importance of, quote, sharing the silence, had to be realized. Those are things that should not be held back. Anybody else?
Yes. My parents came from Poland, and their siblings and their parents were all killed. And they did not know anything other than they were dead. Mm-hmm. So some of it is not hiding or not wanting to discuss it. Sometimes it's just not knowing. Now, my father used to listen to the Jewish radio show, the Jewish Hour. And someone came on and said, does someone know Shlomo Hershkovitz? That was his name in Poland. In America, it was Sam Hirsch. Well, it turned out to be his sister's son. His nephew had survived Auschwitz. And then my father and another relative sponsored him to come here from Israel. When he left Auschwitz, he went to Israel. They put a gun in his hand to fight the Arabs, which he did not want to do, but he had no choice. Then he came to America, and we visited several times, but he was Orthodox and spoke just Yiddish. And the difference between Orthodox and Reform, as you know, is so great. So I shouldn't say we didn't feel a kinship, but he was very alien to us in a way.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's just lack of knowledge.
Sure. By the way, in 1982, we were in Israel when they had the first ever gathering of Holocaust survivors. Now, just imagine that, gathering of Holocaust survivors. I was standing in this huge convention center in Jerusalem, and I saw reunions, the likes of which I've never seen in my life. Because on sheets of paper, you know, so-and-so, so-and-so, I'm here at this reunion, please contact me. It was so poignant that people who thought other people were dead realized they weren't, and the hugs and kisses, just beautiful.
Peter, can you talk about the period of time from when your father departed Dachau till he arrived in the United States? Did he have trouble getting out of Germany? How was that arranged?
No, he had the document. So it was between December, I think that he had a week and a half. They left January 1st, 1939. So exactly what happened there, I'm not sure. All I know is that he went from Dachau to my mom's hometown, and from there they went to Wiesbaden, his hometown, and he said goodbye to his mother and sisters, not realizing probably, you know, that he'd never see them again. Other than that, I have no idea what happened between that time.
It's Sophia again. I have another question. How is it that your father and mother got the paperwork to leave Germany? That's a little surprising that the Germans permitted them to leave at all.
At that point, it was not difficult at all. It became difficult from 1940 on. Because there was a choice: leave, you know, leave or take the consequences. So, you know, they got the paperwork. I have no idea, you know, exactly how. And by the way, the next question you're going to ask me is who sponsored my parents, and the answer is I never found out. I have no idea. But I mean, I know a lot of people, friends of my parents, who, you know, came over between 38 and 40 with no problem whatsoever, as long as they had that affidavit.
Peter?
It's a little bit disappointing that, you know, your parents got a sponsorship that did not extend to the mother and the two sisters. That's heartbreaking, right, in and of itself.
Yeah. Well, my parents, they were a unit, you know, so I think one of the reasons was they would have had to receive the affidavit. There would have been 3 more people. So I'm not sure how many were ready to, you know, offer their assistance to 3 others, you know, in case they had to be on the dole, you know, so.
I have a question.
Yes.
Hello?
Hi.
This is Barbara Simonetti. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. I grew up in Brooklyn, New York. My father was Jewish, my mother was Irish, but a convert to Judaism. They had friends that used to come to the apartment in Brooklyn, and the wife of one of their good friends was a survivor of concentration camp. And I remember being a little girl and seeing the marks that were tattooed, her ID,
Right.
from the camp that she was interned in. And I remember just being horrified at the look of that. And I also had a very good friend up in Westchester, New York, where we were living, me and my husband and raising my children, whose grandmother, who was a Polish woman, she was Polish. Her grandmother is in Yad Vashem, on the wall of the righteous nation wall. Her Polish grandmother and Christian, I believe they were Catholic, saved a Jewish family and hid them in a farmhouse that she owned out in the countryside. She lived in Krakow, but she owned a piece of property with a shack on it in the country, and that's where she hid them.
Right.
So did you go to Yad Vashem when you were in Israel?
Yeah, a number of times. And you're talking about the Garden of the Righteous Gentile, which is, it's amazing. Well, what's amazing is the stories behind them. We have, in Wilmington, we had survivors who were saved also by Gentiles. And one of them hid for 2 years in the sewers of Warsaw. And a sewer worker would bring food to them every day and was never caught. And that's how they survived. The stories are, I mean, you know, the stories of righteous people they're just wonderful.
They are. Thank you so much for this presentation.
You're welcome.
Rabbi Grumbacher, first I want to say thank you. This
Hi.
all too familiar. I have family members that are descendants of Holocaust survivors. They're in Israel. And I remember seeing my cousin's mom and dad with the numbers tattooed. And when they saw me kind of glancing, they pushed down the sleeves right away. I mean, it was a hidden thing. I too have been in Israel several times. I just don't know what to say. It's moving. It's my family. It's incredible. We ought to make a trip. Everyone should go. You ought to take us. Okay? Next year in Jerusalem.
Listen, I've been pushing that. We've taken many, and I go with my Lutheran minister friend, who, by the way, he and I, on one of our trips that we went 3 times, we were going to plan one, and then the virus hit. We were planning it for February. One of the trips, he and I walked into the Children's Memorial in Yad Vashem together.
Oh boy.
The first name, and what they do there is they call out the names of the children who died. It's like just a thread. The first name he heard was Rothenstein, which was the name of his grandmother, because he knew his grandmother was Jewish.
Wow.
You know, so, I mean, he was just wiped out from that.
Yeah, I think, you know, visiting Yad Vashem, you can just get wiped out from.
When was the last time you were there in Yad Vashem?
We would do about 8 years ago.
Yeah, I think that they had redone it. I mean, it's a beautiful, beautiful place now. Beautiful.
Yeah. I have been many times. I'm very close to my family that's there. So I have been to Israel several times. But going back, you know, I grew up in Borough Park, Brooklyn. So now it's a very Hasidic neighborhood. But when I was growing up, I remember seeing neighbors that had the tattoos, the numbers on their arms. Right. And I was told by my parents, never, ever look at it and never say anything.
Right. And you know, interesting, which
it
what
wasn't
I did.
Spoken of. That's it. It was too traumatic. And you just respected it. And if they didn't want to speak about it, then you totally ignored it. Yeah.
Well, interestingly, I found out that Auschwitz was the only camp that put the numbers on. It was the only camp that did that.
Really?
Yeah. The other thing also is that if you want to read an interesting book, I served in for 7 years for the High Holy Days in Jackson, New Jersey. And the man who was my cantor, who served as the singer, his name is David Wisnia, and he wrote a book called One Voice, Two Lives. And it's a memoir, and it's fascinating. So if you want to look, his name is David Wisnia, W-I-S-N-I-A. Just an amazing, amazing story. How his voice saved him.
Rabbi?
Yeah, hi. I know who you are.
Yeah. When I lived in Washington, D.C. area, I just before the Holocaust Museum as it was being built, I was a volunteer interviewer with did Holocaust survivor interviews. I interviewed them over the phone, and then I would pass on my information, and some of them would then be selected to come to Washington to give video testimony. And then they were interviewed by the professional interviewers. And I also had the opportunity to host many of these people when they came. They didn't want to stay in a hotel. They would come and we would either meet them at the airport or the train, or they would drive in. And one of them is a woman named Cecily Klein. And this is a picture of her mother and her nephew in the camp. She found it because the Nazis kept terrific records.
Oh, yeah.
And they were on their way to the gas chamber.
Yeah.
So I keep this book. She gave it, and
That's
it's
great.
described to us.
There's so many books like that. One more thing I forgot. I was initially very opposed to the Holocaust Memorial in Washington, D.C. I just felt it did not belong there, especially on the mall, until I went and saw it. And what really impressed me was the honesty. There was an entire display showing how the State Department, totally negated the Holocaust, and how it would have been so easy to save many, many, many lives, had Roosevelt, the great hero, had Roosevelt bombed, the railroad tracks.
The train track.
Right. So that made me change my mind. By the way, I would like to recommend, it's probably on Netflix or something, see the movie Paperclips. It's about a town in Whitwell, Tennessee. The town is approximately the size of my thumb.
Mm-hmm.
And they have memorials to the victims. It's a story you have to read because it's fascinating. Paperclips. Everybody, just look it up. It's fascinating. I spoke there on my tour.
Let me ask you, Rabbi, how do you confront anti-Semitism when you find it here? How would you do it? What do we do? It's happening.
Yeah, I know it is. I know. It's a very difficult question to answer. It has to be through education. You can't say there's no response. People who have hate have hate. Usually they can't be changed. But education when the kids are young, Delaware just put it in their curriculum. Mandated education for the Holocaust. It's got to be there because people have to learn. In South Pacific in the musical, there's a song, "You've got to be taught to hate and fear."
We hate.
And it's true. So if that's why I love to speak to kids.
To the kids today, it's ancient history.
It's more than ancient history. When I started this thing, it was ancient history. Now it's even older than that.
But thank you very much.
Welcome.
Good comment.
Peter, I'm Richard Stolzfus, and I just want to share briefly a story about goodness. There are those good people out there.
Yep.
There's a video of this elderly gentleman sitting in the front row, many people behind him. The MC says to the group, "How many of you here owe your life to this gentleman?" Everybody stood up. He was responsible during the war for getting young children out of, I think, Poland. He kept precise records of all these children's names, and they tracked them as adults. And
wow,
it's a very, very moving video.
What's his name? Do you remember?
I don't remember, but you can find it on YouTube. I'm sure you can find it.
Unbelievable. Yep, you don't hear enough of those stories of goodness.
And we need more of that today in the news. Believe me, those kind of stories.
No kidding.
Rabbi?
Yeah.
I'd just like to say, before I retired, I did psychiatric consultations in nursing homes. And fairly frequently, I would be asked to see an elderly gentleman who was depressed. And at times, it turned out it was a World War II veteran. And as they would talk about their life, they would start telling stories from the war, and the families would be aghast. I never knew Dad went through that, they would say. And it was such a healing experience. But I think what happened is suddenly they were in a nursing home, all their old coping mechanisms of work and being active and pulling themselves up by the bootstraps were gone.
That's
and
right.
so the memories would start coming back. And so I really appreciate your telling your father's story, because it obviously happened on both sides.
Yeah. Thank you.
I would like it very much if Rodney could put together and send to us some of the books and films that have been recommended to watch or read. That would be really good. I couldn't write down so fast everything that, that Rodney was posting or other people were posting. That would be appreciated.
This book about the first ambassador to Germany, it was written by Eric Larson, and it's something about the garden of the, it's in the Garden of the Beast.
Yeah, and Barbara, do know Peter's correct. A lot of resources have been shared in the chat window, and anytime Peter or someone else would mention a book or a video, I would go find a link and post it in the chat window. My reason for doing so is we are recording today's presentation. It will be available on the website, and when you play back that video, you can see the chat window. You don't have to wait until the end of the video to see the full chat transcript. You'll be able to revisit the video, click on those links, and continue learning after today's presentation. And there are a couple of books there, a couple of movies there. Peter, I do know that we're coming up on time, and a couple of things. One, just thank you for sharing this remarkable story. You've heard that again from the folks here. Just not just the story, but the remembrances of your father and everyone else who contributed to the discussion that followed the presentation. I think it's just a wonderful learning opportunity when we can see how our stories intersect. And I should have said at the beginning, our friend Kathy Clancy is part of our volunteer committee that made this possible and arranged for Rabbi Grumbacher to join us today. Kathy and every volunteer who's part of our program, thank you for making things like this happen. And I'll just pause in case anyone else wants to say a final parting word. Or Peter, you may as well.
Well, I appreciate all of you who tuned in. I have a feeling that in many respects, it's like preaching to the choir, because you knew what the subject was, you didn't have to listen. But again, if you can, any opportunity you have to just set people straight about what's going on today, what went on in the Holocaust, that would be just wonderful for me and for all of those in my generation.
With that, I'll say thank you again. And friends, take care and be well until we're with you again next time, which will be on the 20th. We'll have a presentation by Dr. Ann Henriksen, and the title of that will be Your Brain on Strings. She's going to talk about how our mind is part of perceiving and making sense of sound. Again, thank you, Rabbi Grumbacher. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for inviting me.
You're very welcome.